To money and banking. In the first week, we will focus on why economists study money and banking and cover some of the fundamental definitions we'll use throughout the course. Colloquially, you may hear the word financial most often in conjuncture with the word crisis. The reason for this is that the last recession from 2007 to 2009 was triggered by the largest banking crisis since the 1940s Great Depression. While finance is an ongoing function of the macroeconomy, we really tend to mostly see it when the market chokes up. Otherwise, we take for granted many of the fundamental services provided by finance, such as a standard payment system of money, debit cards, or online payments, or access to credit through credit cards or mortgages. Financial markets, in their most narrow definition, are markets where economic agents like governments, firms, or households exchange funds over time. At any given point in time, some agents within the macroeconomy have excess funds at their disposal which they do not need, while others lack funds for a particular economic activity. For instance, a mid-career household may have higher disposable income than its current consumption levels, prompting it to save, while a startup firm may not have the necessary funds to purchase production equipment, prompting it to borrow. The exchange of such funds occurs within financial markets. Finance itself, thus, is not a direct productive activity in the sense that it does not produce consumption or investment goods like cars or video games or industrial equipment. Rather, financial exchange is a subsidiary function of the economy designed to facilitate savings and investment. Government also participates in significant financial exchange, typically as a borrower, although also plays an important role in supervision and regulation. In the US, financial exchange accounts for only in between 5 and 6% of overall employment, not a particularly large market, although this share is slightly higher at around 6.5% in the 50 largest metro areas, so finance is more concentrated in cities than outside of them. However, since finance is a high value-added activity, it holds a much higher production share of just a little under 10% of GDP. In many locations, financial industry incomes support other, what economists call derivative industries, like leisure, hospitality, or real estate. For these reasons, outside of technology and healthcare, finance is thus considered one of the major economic drivers of the US economy. Now, in a narrow technical sense, financial markets funnel funds from one part of the economy to another. This can either occur as direct exchange with the help of so-called securities that include most commonly IOUs like bonds or titles of ownership like stocks. However, it can also occur indirectly with the help of specialized firms referred to as financial intermediaries. The most significant financial intermediaries are banks, but there are others like mutual funds or insurance companies that you are undoubtedly familiar with. Much of financial exchange occurs with the help of financial intermediaries, and we'll discuss in the following why that is. Before we go there, let's talk a little bit about the macroeconomic relevance of financial markets. Within an economy, the exchange of funds is the fundamental fuel for investment, as in the purchase of capital goods, not in the financial sense, and of consumption. Practically all firms operate on borrowed funds that are not originally brought in by their owners. Instead, most firms rely on banks, they might rely on bond markets, or short-term funding markets like commercial paper markets. Similarly, households need to borrow and lend over their life cycle to efficiently smooth out consumption. Now, the idea of consumption smoothing is linked to Milton Friedman's permanent income hypothesis. And standard economic theory along these lines assumes that individuals base their consumption on expected rather than their current income. So the idea is, if I think my average income is in the vicinity of about $50,000 a year, I will consume accordingly, even if my current income may be lower or higher than that. This has implications for household behavior over the lifetime. When households are young, they typically have low incomes and must borrow to cover their expenses. As households mature, they make higher incomes than their expenditure, which they can use to pay off their original debt and build up savings. Finally, when households retire, their incomes drop again, and the fruit of their savings can be consumed. Such consumption smoothing can only work with financial markets, and especially the borrowing component, is difficult to achieve in the absence of developed finance. In a more macroeconomic context, we can place financial markets within the simple models of the aggregate economy you have seen in intro to macro or in intermediate macro. For instance, in short-term business cycle models, like the simple multiplier model, financial markets appear in the so-called IS relationship. Recall from your intro class that in the short run, equilibrium GDP Y star is equal to C plus I plus G in a closed economy. I could add net exports to that, but for the sake of the argument, we'll leave it out. C is consumption, I is investment, G is government expenditure. Now, since everything that is produced also generates an income for someone, Y star is also equal to household income. And households can only do three things with their income. They can consume it, they can save it, or they get to pay taxes with it. So Y star also needs to equal C plus S plus T. Now, substituting equation 1 into equation 2 and simplifying yields the IS relationship that you probably have seen at some point, you may not remember it. What this is stating is that in equilibrium, private saving, whatever household saves, need to equal investment plus the government budget deficit. In other words, whatever is leaking out of the circular flow in terms of incomes, whatever households save, enters financial markets where firms will, for instance, borrow from these savings to invest, or where the government will, for instance, borrow to pay off its outstanding deficit. So the exchange of this saving-investment relationship occurs within financial markets. This also explains why in the short run, if financial exchange chokes up, if for whatever reason this exchange no longer is efficient, it has implications for the business cycle. For instance, the cost of borrowing will increase and firms in the short run will invest less. Meanwhile, in the long run, when we think about economic growth, finance plays two roles. For one, it funds investment, which in turn helps build up the stock of a nation's productive capital, that is machinery, buildings, and such, which adds to the overall amount of productive resources. However, such investment can only create what economists refer to as transitory growth due to the law of diminishing returns. This particular relationship is not something I'm going to jump into detail here. It is something that is discussed in intermediate. I'm obviously happy to discuss that for you as well. Just be aware that capital accumulation in of itself is not considered the prime engine of economic growth. So why does finance matter then? Well, it turns out finance is also necessary to fund innovation, that is the expansion of available productive technology. And that, as it turns out, is considered the main source of long-run growth. Venture capitalists, for instance, which fund startup companies until they can go public, are probably the most visible source of such funding, but more traditional outlets like banks also provide resources to innovators. In economic growth theory, the role of finance thus began to play an important role in the endogenous growth literature of the 1990s. We're not going to talk much about economic growth in the particular context of this class, but be mindful that economists believe finance contributes to long-term growth in its role of identifying productive innovation and funding it. In conclusion, financial markets thus are the central fuel tanks for household consumption and firm investment. This explains why financial crises, and especially those of the banking sector, like that in 2008, play such an important macroeconomic role. If banks incur mass losses, not only is their own share of production lost, those 10% of GDP I mentioned earlier, but it also affects household wealth and consumption and investment inversely, since it stimulates credit, which funds almost all other economic